Hello, and welcome to the R. Scott Falk Memorial Program, Heather Cox Richardson on Democracy Awakening. I'm Meredith Falk, and I'm thrilled to introduce Heather Cox Richardson. Each year, our family sponsors a Humanities event in my dad's memory. He was invited by a friend about 30 years ago to an event like this one, and he was immediately hooked. He loved nothing more than to grab drinks with friends afterwards and analyze the day's learning. He ultimately served on the Humanities board for several years before his death. It is our hope that today's program inspires open-minded conversation for you as well. Heather Cox Richardson is a professor of history at Boston College and an expert on American political and economic history. She's the author of 7 books, including the award-winning How the South Won the Civil War. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Guardian, among other outlets. Her widely read newsletter, Letters from an American, synthesizes history and modern political issues.
Hi, I'm Jack Falk. Meredith's my older sister, and I will be introducing William Howell. William Howell is inaugural dean of the School of Government and Policy at Johns Hopkins University, where he holds an appointment in the Department of Political Science. William has widely written on separation of power issues in American political institutions, especially the presidency. He currently is working on research projects on separation of power issues, the institutional foundations of effective government, and emergent threats to democracy. We are thrilled to be partnering with Professor William Howell on our festival day at the Athenaeum. Professor Howell will be leading both this morning's conversation with Heather Cox Richards, and following this discussion, he will join us at 1:30 for a conversation with historian Timothy Snyder for a discussion on freedom. We hope that many of you will be able to join us for that conversation as well. Now, please join my sister and I in welcoming both Heather Cox Richardson and William Howell. What? Good.
They're glad to see you.
And I'm glad to be here. Thank everybody for coming.
Heather, we have an hour together, and we've got a lot of ground to cover. We had a chance a year ago at the Humanities Festival here to reflect on the state of democracy with your then recently published book, and what a year it has been since then. We won't rehash the whole year, but yeah, a thing that you do powerfully, and I think what might be sitting behind some of the enthusiasm here is not just the wisdom that you provide, but the orientation that you offer, a sense of where are we and what's at stake and where are we sitting in something larger when what's immediately before us feels unnerving, anxiety-producing. And I thought we might take some time to unpack where we sit today. There are, in a presidency, 1,461 days.
But who's counting?
Yeah. Well, we're at 97. And what a 97 days it has been. And I wonder, to kick things off, there's so much happening on foreign, on domestic, on social, on economic, on health and well-being of democracy, on matters involving culture, and it's all over the place. What are the threads, the themes, the topics that you're paying particular attention to in this moment?
I'm actually paying attention to a lot of different things, because one of the things that happened right out of the box when President Donald Trump took office on January 20th of 2025 was immediately he launched an attack on Congress. That was the defunding of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, which has been established by the courts and by the laws that a president cannot intrude on the laws that the Congress makes, including appropriations. And that initial attack on Congress was a huge red flag right out of the box. So the attack on Congress and now the attack on the courts is obviously an attempt to create a very strong president, about which you have written a lot, an attempt to create a very strong president. But that's not the only theme that's of interest, because we also have the deliberate attack on the U.S. economy and the deliberate attack on business and the attack on education and all these different attacks on culture and the pillars of American society, which are another project. And then there is also the fact that what I feel like we're seeing is not breaking the law alone. It's not breaking the Constitution alone. It is something that I would call extra-constitutional, people acting as if there is no Constitution and they can do whatever they want, which is one of the ways it makes it very hard for people to catch up with things like the Department of Government Efficiency, because that's not actually a thing. So, if you had somebody taking over an existing agency and breaking the law, you could say, oh, well, this is how this works. This person goes and gets that person, and then somebody goes to jail. But in this case, it's like, It's like all of a sudden there's a Martian doing something, or he wishes, I guess. And so how do you grapple with that and put that into the context of what's happening in the United States? And so I think about it kind of like an onion. If there's all these stories I'd understand, then I'd go to the next layer back of the onion. Can I make sense of it this way? And then I go back one more step. Can I make sense of it this way? And where I am right now is, it seems to me that President Donald Trump is not actually in charge of the presidency. He does not seem to me to be mentally fit. If you listen to him, he's all over the map. He keeps saying he doesn't understand what's going on. He can't carry on a conversation. So who's actually running the presidency? And it seems to me there are three different groups that are vying for power in the presidency. And that's important, because there's the president, but then there's the presidency. And that piece of our system, the power of the presidency, seems to me to be sloshing among three different groups. There are the Project 2025 people who are operating out of the Office of Management and Budget and Russell Vogt, who are the ones putting in place all these executive orders and tearing down the different aspects of our government that we have grown to become accustomed to. Then there are the technology guys, the tech bros, who are trying to destroy the U.S. government as well, in order to both put a lot of contracts into their own pockets, but also to destroy regulations. And then there's a third group that seems to me to be run by Stephen Miller, who is the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, but possibly also with the help of Kristi Noem, who's the Secretary of Homeland Security. And possibly Holman. I mean, the part of the problem is all this is very opaque. You can't tell who's doing what. But you have these three different groups that are fighting for control of the presidency. And that goes back to our extra-constitutional moment. It seems to me, and many of you probably heard me talk about this before, we don't talk in the United States a lot about power. We talk about institutions more than we talk about power. And in this moment, power is sloshing around in the U.S. government. And one of the things that I'm watching very closely is to see who grabs it. And it really seemed like it was Elon Musk who was grabbing it, and now he seems to be on the outs, but now he's got all our data. Stephen Miller seems to be trying to grab it right now. One of the things I'm trying to push is to make sure that as this power sloshes around, the people who really grab it is us, because it actually belongs to us.
So Trump, a story about the last 8 years is really, though, about Trump taking charge of the Republican Party in ways that we haven't seen any single individual exercise that level of centrality. If not control, then at least he is at the center of things, and people are constantly understanding the power that they grab or that they wield in relation to him and his goodwill. So how do we think about that? That is, he's not irrelevant here at all, right? He is sitting at the center of things.
Those two things are not incompatible. He took over the Republican Party because he found a way to control a very strong voter base. And one of the things that's worth, I think, remembering now is there is a fight for control of the Republican Party even still, because for all that Trump is talking about running in 2028, here's a news flash. That man is not going to be even vaguely coherent in 2028. And I don't think I'm saying that because I don't like him. Listen to him and compare him even to 2016, or then go back to the 1980s when he was suave and charming and, he was quick, and that is not the case anymore. So for all the fact they talk about that, I think that's in part because there is nobody who can pick up the MAGA voters. We know that he's the one who turns out MAGA voters. So if he's not on the ticket, you think anybody is going to show up to vote for J.D. Vance? Think of other people like that. So he took over the Republican Party because of those voters. Now he no longer has the power to pass that on to somebody, those voters on to somebody else. So yes, he has taken over the Republican Party. It is no longer the Republican Party, it's the Trump Party, but there's a number of people who voted because there were R's next to their names who did not believe they were voting for the destruction of American democracy, which is what they're seeing. And so we're in this extraordinarily volatile time politically where the Democrats as well are changing the way they're appealing to people. The Republicans are changing. And somebody said to me the other day, who's our leader? Who's our leader? And I'm like, we don't know who the leader is yet because there are so many different impulses out there. But you are seeing, for example, Joe Rogan, who backed Donald Trump in the last election and is not any longer the largest podcaster in the United States. That is now Midas Touch. But he can command millions of people, and he's against the extraordinary renditions. So you see this, and you're watching all these different balloons being floated for what matters, including especially the things about Abrego Garcia, trying to get Abrego Garcia back. And I think we are seeing a major realignment in the United States, and it is this, again, is a place where people speaking up can make what they want articulate enough that a leader will say, an upcoming leader, or maybe one that already exists, will say, I want that person's votes, therefore I am going to act in this way. I don't think it's an accident that Democrats have been going down to El Salvador.
Mm-hmm. So we got a lot of plot lines at the center. We got a lot. But we've got at the core, you've pointed our attention to a few things. This concern about extra constitutionality of the ways that power is being exercised, a fight over who is going to wield that power. Are there things, as we try to get clarity about this present moment, are there plot lines that you think are overblown? Things that you'd say, that's not where the action is. We're talking too much about it, or put that one aside because the stakes, the real stakes, when we think about the health and well-being of our democracy, lie elsewhere.
I don't think there are things that are overblown. It's very easy to sort of react to everything that's around you all the time, and much of it is very, very important. The executive orders, maybe not so much. A lot of them are performative. Obviously the arrest of the Wisconsin judge was a performance. That's probably not going to go very far. And reading into that, it's very important. And I don't mean to suggest it's not, but reading into that struck me as a sign of weakness, not of strength, because the Trump administration knows that it is now literally underwater, which means more people disapprove than approve on every single thing, including immigration. They are doubling down on getting harder and harder on playing to their anti-immigrant base. And so we're going to see a lot more of that. So there are things like that that are overblown. What I think is understudied, really understudied, is the extraordinary amount of organization to fight back against this administration, largely among especially older women. And that is, I'll tell you an anecdote. I was talking somewhere it was a round table. I don't actually remember where. It's a long oval table, and somebody was saying, a man was saying, nobody's organizing. These people being in the streets, it's just not going to matter. There's not enough going on. And I said, well, I don't think I'd say that, because I'm actually every week on a number of very large organizing calls on social media. And I said, these are largely, I think they're going under the radar screen, but many people are on these calls, and every woman at the table went like this. And all the men were like, and I thought, that's a really important aspect of where we are that is almost invisible. I'm right about that, aren't I? Like you? Yeah.
So I'm still in the hunt for some clarity. Not that you're not providing it. I mean, clarity about how do we get oriented in this moment and see the stakes involved. Can you say a bit about your thoughts about Trump 2 versus Trump 1?
Sure. And I will say about orienting ourselves, the confusion is the plan. The more stuff that comes at you all the time, the easier it is for them to establish a narrative. And if you look at the White House comms department, what they are doing now is rapid response, flood the zone, get headlines all the time. And this is how we got that horrific video about what they were planning to do with Gaza. And it's funny because it sounds like nobody saw that, but there was literally a gold statue in that of President Trump, or the video of the men who were rendered to El Salvador. That video was a professionally done video that they produced in the moment, to the point that I actually called my video guy and said, "Did they pre-do this?" And he said, "No, if they had a really, really good team, they could have turned this out." So the idea is for them to create confusion so that they can create a narrative. And now I forgot what your question was. Making sense of it. I will say that that one of the things that I try and do, and that I think we have common ground on, and the thing that I reach for, is our shared history of a set of values. Because that's accessible to everybody, whether or not you agree with them or not. But it reminds you, hey, I heard this in second grade. Hey, I remember this. I know who Lincoln is. Wait a minute, George Washington, Paul Revere, they did something. Those are things that I remember. And if you strip us back to our history and the noble principles and the places we both achieved and failed those, I think we find a common language that puts ground under our feet.
Mm-hmm.
Trump 1, Trump 2.
Thank you.
Trump 1 had the guardrails around. I wrote about this the other night. The establishment Republicans wanted to make sure there wasn't going to be a Democrat in office, so they went with Trump, and they figured they could put guardrails around him, and for the most part they did. This time we don't have those people in place. So as I wrote the other day, those MAGA Americans who believed in those three pillars I talked about are now in control of the United States with no guardrails. So before the election, if you knew about Project 2025, somebody who knew about Project 2025 in the United States, if you knew about it, only 4% of Americans wanted it and liked it. 96 did not. So those 4% are now the ones that are controlling everything. And they're ideological, which is anti-conservative. They're ideological. They're also incompetent. And that, you laugh, but that matters a lot. Imagine if you had a 40-year-old, really smart Donald Trump in office right now, and that would make it way more difficult to do the sorts of, to fight back against that. Somebody wrote the other day, and I read a lot of legal commentary, I'm not a lawyer, and somebody said, this just proves there are no good lawyers left in the administration. And I would add, and this is really important, when they just did a recent filing in which instead of attaching what they wanted to, they attached the letter from their own lawyers saying, you are going to lose this case. And think about what that means. All of you who have worked in offices as secretaries or assistants and so on, you'd get fired for that. And this was somebody who was operating at the highest levels of the DOJ. It helps that they're not terribly competent.
But there's an ascendance here too. That is, Trump won a majority of the vote. They have control of both.
Trump won a plurality of the vote.
Plurality of the vote. That's right. That's fine.
Yeah.
That's right. But when you look at the changes between 2020 and 2024, he picked up votes in just about every county in the country and basically every sociodemographic group. And now Republicans have control of the House and the Senate and a solid majority of the Supreme Court. And so...
I'm laughing because you know the answer to this. You're setting me up.
No, I'm not setting you up. But
he's a political scientist, by the way, if you didn't know.
But they're not just flailing about. Their Project 2025 was a plan, and it was in the service of conservatives getting organized, which they are executing on in important ways. This isn't just a story of public opinion that's underwater or incompetence. This is also a story of ascendance and Trump exercising in his own way a measure of control over his party, which is extraordinary.
Well, he has the party. It's his party now. Yeah. It's not the Republican Party any longer. But there is no doubt that Project 2025 was a plan, and it's a plan that is being put into place. That's true as well. But I'm laughing because this is a moving target. Politics is always a moving target. And we now know that Trump is at the lowest popularity rating of any president in 80 years after he's not quite at 100 days yet, so we got a little more room to maneuver.
Wednesday.
Is it Wednesday?
Wednesday.
And there is this idea of ascendancy, but I would argue, because you do numbers and systems and I do ideology, and I would argue that it was easy for people to talk about hating the federal government and we got to cut and we got to do all these things. We got to get rid of immigrants and we got to get rid of reproductive health care. We got to get rid of all this stuff because those guardrails were there. Nobody thought they were really going to go away. And I always think about it like, toddlers complain bitterly is one way to put it against their parents because they know their parents are always going to love them. They behave elsewhere. Now, all of a sudden, the toddler has the keys to the car and is Americans who were perfectly willing to say, yeah, we need to cut some of the government are now like, but not the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration that tells us what our weather is, not FEMA, not, the people who inspect for salmonella, not, wait a minute, we actually care a lot about that government. And now we have the problem of being an ideological group who are not conservatives, by the way. They're extremist radicals. And that's an important distinction. They call themselves conservatives, but that's not a conservative platform. Now we have the problem that they're trying to force that on the rest of us in an extra-constitutional way. So that leaves the pushback hard to do because it's a little hard to say, we don't like anything you're doing. Let's talk about the Constitution, when in fact, we don't have the Senate, we don't have the House of Representatives, and we do have the problem with the Supreme Court. In contrast, though, to that, we also have the fact that those are razor-tight majorities for the Republicans, and they are there because of gerrymandering in the House. And those people would also like to have a country to inherit on the other side. And they are very aware of how unpopular Trump is. So I don't think we can sit here and say, as people do, well, and we'll get him in 2026. I think this is a crisis that is building by the day. And we still, if you look at the problems with the tariffs, for example, and what that's doing not only to the economy, but also to confidence in the United States as a safe haven, which is incredibly important because it enables us not only to borrow more cheaply than we could otherwise, but also underpins the global economy. If you look at that, and if you look at how these opinions are changing, and the fact that that is only right now prospective, except for the bond market, that the tariffs haven't hit yet. I don't know if you're watching this, but traffic into West Coast ports is down 50% for next month. And that's not just goods that won't be coming in, that's truckers who won't have jobs and so forth, so on and so forth. So we're looking essentially at a self-created pandemic supply chain issue, except we created the pandemic with Donald Trump. So, we're sort of arguing about whether the glass is half full or half empty. I think it's changing day by day. And it's not at all clear that which side of it is going to win.
Put Trump into an even broader perspective. You said he's not conservative, decidedly not. Are there ways that about which you've written a great deal, the long history of conservatism in this country leads to Trump? Or with Trump, is it a sharp right turn? Or I don't know how to think about this spatially. A break from
supernova.
Yeah, there we go.
Trump's a salesman. Trump was never a politician. He was a salesman. He could sell anybody anything. And, Bill Maher apparently has not caught on to that because, and mind you, I have every confidence that if I had a one-on-one conversation with Trump and he wanted something from me, he would charm me. He would work to charm me like he does everybody else. It's a skill set. He's very, very good at it. And he's a very good speaker. He until recently, he can't do a speech anymore. But even in 2016, he was very good at that. He was very good at convincing an audience that he was on their side and he would give them what they wanted and so on, the same way a salesman does. But he was able to sell a certain line to the American people because of not a conservative movement in the United States, movement conservatism. And that's a very different thing because conservatism talks about preserving what is secure and stable in a polity, and it focuses on creating a government that is based not in ideology so much as in stability. You want to create stability for families, for finances, and so on. The way we got movement conservatism was in 1937. Those people who hated FDR were really appalled when he won the election in 1936. They thought he was a flash in the pan in 32, and everybody would get, enlightened between 32 and 36, and they would turn him out on his ears, and instead he wins re-election. So in 37, they come together and they say, we got to get rid of this guy. Republicans, especially Republicans in the West, said we got to get rid of FDR because we don't want regulations and we don't want taxes. And the Southern Democratic racists said, we don't want FDR because we don't want any hints toward equality of races. And they also picked up the religious traditionalists, especially the Southern Baptists, who didn't like the idea of women having equality in the United States because that overturned the entire idea of a family dominated by a man that they believed reflected the system that God had put forward to govern the human race, men in charge of everything. They come together in 37 and they produce what's called a conservative manifesto. And what they mean by conservative is get us back before FDR to the 1920s. It has nothing to do with whether it works, as we know the New Deal did. It has no reflection on anything other than get this dude out of office and give us back the government we had in the 1920s, which, in case you didn't notice, didn't go very well for a lot of people. That became movement conservatism. It was a political movement. And they were radical. They wanted to get rid of the New Deal government. And look where we are right now. Donald Trump is actually doing it. But the vast majority of Americans like that government. We like business regulation. We like social safety. We like infrastructure. We like civil rights. And so they are putting this in place, calling themselves conservatives when they are actually destroying what is essentially a conservative government, conservative in the sense it promotes stability. Now, in the United States, conservative had meant something very different than it originally did in Europe, where it was first articulated by Edmund Burke. And in America, nobody talked a lot about conservatism in the early years of the Republic because there was nothing to conserve, right? They were literally figuring it out as they went along. They start to talk about conservatism when people in the North reject the Compromise of 1850, the piece of the Compromise of 1850 that says that people in the northern states have to return to enslavement their black neighbors who have escaped out of the South. And that often meant that people who were actually legally free everywhere in the United States were getting kidnapped and rendered into enslavement. And Northerners said, ain't happening. You are not coming into our free states and taking our black neighbors and throwing them into slavery. So we're not going to adhere to that part of the Compromise of 1850. And when they did that, elite Southern enslavers called them radicals. And they begin to say, no, wait a minute, we're not radicals. We are the ones who are conservative. We are trying to preserve America the way it was before you started to try and take over the entire nation. And it's Abraham Lincoln who really makes that a very powerful argument, beginning in 1858 and then in 1859 and, of course, in 1860, in which he says, we are the true conservatives because we are the ones who are trying to preserve the Declaration of Independence that says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And when I talk about myself as a Lincoln conservative, it's actually a beautiful turn that Lincoln does there. He says, those of us who care about human rights and equality in the United States and the concept that you have a right to be treated equally before the law and have a right to have a say in your government, we are the true conservatives. And that's the ground I stand on.
Yeah. The movement conservatives, which is not the ground you stand on, but you would count Reagan among them, correct?
Reagan's interesting.
Yeah, I want to hear.
Reagan is very, there's this whole, from 37 forward, this thread that goes through American political history is virtually unchanged. And what the people wanted in 37 in the Conservative Manifesto is they wanted to get rid of business regulation because that hampered a man's ability to run his business as he wanted. They wanted to get rid of a social safety net because that cost taxes, and that too took away from a man's ability to run his business the way he wanted to. That belonged, as they said, to the churches. They wanted to get rid of infrastructure funding because that should all be privatized because there was money to be made in it. And they wanted to get rid of civil rights because that belonged to the states, who were allowed to have home rule, by which they meant segregation. Does that sound familiar? That theme has run through American history ever since. So you see it, obviously, in 37. You see it picked up in 1951 by William F. Buckley Jr. when he writes God and Man at Yale, or The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. That's the subtitle of that book. You see it with The Rise of Barry Goldwater. You see it with The Conscience of a Conservative, which is ghost-written by William F. Buckley Jr.'s brother-in-law, L. Brent Bazell. Same themes, exact same themes as you saw in the Conservative Manifesto. You saw it in the rise of Ronald Reagan and the way Ronald Reagan talked, and he really brought movement conservatism into the White House. But he talked as a movement conservative, but he often governed as what we would now call an establishment Republican. So that's why everybody claims Reagan, is you can get anything you want out of Reagan. But Reagan is, of course, following on the heels of Richard Nixon, who very deliberately began to polarize the country, who very deliberately reached for the Southern Democratic Dixiecrats, the ones who were segregationist. Nixon started the Republican Party down that road. Reagan built on it, and then from there on, it's been a straight shot to Donald Trump.
Okay.
Not straight. George H.W. Bush was something different. Sorry.
We don't want to forget Bush, but the straight shot is interesting in that you just noted that Reagan in some ways governed as a classic conservative. Trump, too, is not a conservative anyway. He's quite radical. Reagan, as a movement conservative, was, at least rhetorically, much more positive towards immigration, much more positive towards a liberal international trade regime. In comes Trump, who is as anti-immigrant and hostile towards free trade as they come. They sound very different to me.
That's the base. That's the base that he cultivated. And I would argue that the Republican Party stayed in power with initially dog whistles, although some of us didn't really think they were very quiet dog whistles, or at least that our hearing was pretty good, to the racists and the traditional religious factions of that original movement conservative coalition. And you saw this instantly with Reagan, of course, with his speech in Mississippi, in which he talked about states' rights, right very near where the 3 men were killed, promoting civil rights less than 15 years before, as I recall, but I'd have to check the numbers. Maybe it was slightly more than that. And And you saw it as well with his talk from the very beginning about preserving segregation academies, and also with his emphasis on family values, which was a call to putting women back in the positions they were in the 1920s, especially in those traditional religious places like the Southern Baptists. Reagan brings the Southern Baptist into his coalition, of course. But they had that call to voters because they knew they could turn voters out with that concept of positive polarization, which Spiro Agnew under Nixon really pushes. The idea, they called it positive polarization because if you could convince a population to be afraid of something, they were more likely to turn out to vote. And he was very articulate about this, especially in '72. He said, this is my job. I'm creating positive polarization. Reagan did that, and the Republicans have done so since. Even George H.W. Bush, who was losing by 17 points in the summer of the year before, the year before the presidential election that year, and he turned his campaign around with the Willie Horton ad. That was an attempt, again, to go toward that idea of we're going to make people terrified of Black Americans in this case. And then the constant repetition of the idea of abortion being the central issue for America, which was pretty clearly about women and their role in American society. So they created this voting base, never expecting it would really be in power, because what they really wanted was business deregulation and tax cuts. They never really thought that these people would drive the train. They were only supposed to be pushing it along. Well, what Trump did is he took a look at that base and he said, I can turn these people out, but he didn't know it was a sleight of hand. He figured it was, this was what the Republicans were going to do. This was popular. This is how you got people screaming in the aisles. This is what you did. And so he played to that. And interestingly enough, you didn't ask this, but I think it's really interesting. If you probably don't remember this, but when he first took office, Trump really tried to be a kind of normal president. Remember, he had a state dinner with Abe of Japan. He went to the Kennedy Center where people booed him, but he did go, and he did normal stuff. And that changed in August of 2017 with the Charlottesville, Virginia, Unite the Right rally, when he said that there are good people on both sides. And he did say that. There's a million transcripts. He didn't say it in exactly those words, but that is not a mischaracterization because he had no choice. He needed those people. But when he did that and the establishment Republicans began to turn on him, he went more and more and more toward that side. And if you look, you may not know this, but if you go on Wikipedia, you can actually do virtually any modern presidency event by event by event, which I didn't realize until I was writing a sequel to, I think it was either this book or the one before it. And I'm like, what happened in 2018? Like, I know everything about the period up to 2017, and then I'm really good from 2019 on because of the letters. But what happened in 2018? And I went and looked, and it's almost like this period in which he gets incredibly unstable. That's the period where we hear about him being a very stable genius and all that. There's like this weird space in there. And that feels to me like a very important space because he begins to turn that base into not just voters, but into a movement that will rally around him with violence if necessary. And we saw how that played out in 2021, January 6, 2021. And I think that what you're seeing then is Trump having switched from, hey, yeah, I can play this game with the rhetoric, to their mind.
I'm going to let that sit. We're going to go in 5 minutes to Q&A, and there's a way to post questions on a QR. I think it's going to appear. I believe so. You can post them electronically. If I might ask a few questions about you and the work that you do.
Sure, but I'm much less interesting than this.
No, you
This
are.
is kind of me. This is what I do. My poor husband, I'm like, did you see this? He's like, no, tell me about it.
Where do you get your news?
Everywhere. I get my news. I wake up every morning and I read social media for probably an hour and a half just to see, and that's both Blue Sky and the other one, I read it. I don't post on it any longer because I want to see what people are talking about. I want to see what the different stories are, and I want to see unusual stuff. There are a number of people who send me feeds, and the people who send me who are the best by far are people who are just people who follow the news. They're not journalists or nothing else. They're just people who follow the news and have their own curated lists. So I read everything that people send me, and then I start with Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo. You see, he often shows up. He has a doctorate in American history. For years, I've been saying from Princeton. It's apparently from Brown, or maybe I've got it wrong. It's one of those. He's very, very smart, and he often sees things that I think are important. Then I go from there to major newspapers in every major city across the country. Chicago Sun-Times here, by the way. And I read to see what their stories are. You'd be shocked at how often there isn't a lot of variation. But then once I see what I think the major stories are, then I research them. So one of the things people always say to me is, you read 3 military newspapers every day. And I'm like, no, I don't. I read one almost every day. I read military.com because that's where most veterans and their families read. But, and I read there's an official one as well. But if there's a military story out there, I know where my top 4 or 5 sources are, and then I can go more deeply into it than that. So I'm a researcher. I do history. I don't really do news. So that's where I learn stuff.
Did you say you spent an hour and a half? The first hour and a half is just on the social media?
Yes.
So is it now like 4 o'clock in the afternoon when you're getting to the military.com?
No, I read very quickly, I have to say. And once you do this, I know it sounds hugely impressive, but it's not really, because think about last night. The story of or I guess it was 2 nights ago, but I wrote about it last night. The story of the 3 U.S. citizens who were sent out of the country, not deported, because you can't deport a U.S. citizen. There were thousands of stories about those, but there was very little different information one to another. So I decided what I wanted to know, and then, because the story itself was obvious, then I looked in different places for different pieces of information. So one of the reasons I chose one of the citations I did was because of the 10-year-old girl with brain cancer who was sent out of the country to Mexico in March. She had siblings with her that did not make it into many of the news stories, and they were all American citizens too. There were 5 siblings, 4 were U.S. citizens. That was only in one news story that I found, and it was a reputable source, so I used that particular one. That takes less time than you would think, but this is now a full life job.
Yeah. Okay, that's the taking in, but you also write. Do you have a routine? How do you write?
Well, this is the ideal, it never happens, but this is the ideal. Ideally, I read, and then I try and get repetitive exercise for a couple of hours, walking or kayaking, and thinking about the larger issues at stake. And once you know what the story is, and you know this from books, once you know what the story is, it's not a huge deal to write. What really takes me a lot of time is nailing all the details, because that's very, very hard to do. And you'll notice that a lot of people just sort of elide over them. But I'm determined to actually put them in there because I'm writing it for a graduate student in 150 years, and I know she's tired already. And she's going to want to know. That's one of the reasons I do the citations. And also because I have the world's best copy editor, and she does not let me get away with anything. Anything. So last night I quoted from a video, and she said, I don't see a transcript. And I'm like, come on. And she's like, it's got to be right. If I know what the pattern is, then it's easy. The hard one, and tonight it's in my head. I can already tell you what tonight's going to be unless something happens while I'm on this stage. But the hard ones are when there are like 8 big stories, but they're not top stories. They're secondary stories, and they don't seem to have any rhyme or reason. And those are almost impossible. And sometimes I'll just have to hold a story for another day, because as a writer, you know that if you have 2 big stories in the same piece, you cancel each other out. They cancel each other out. So that part of the crafting, that can be a lot. And 2 nights ago, one of the mornings when it didn't go up until at least 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, that's because it didn't look like a hard piece. It looked very simple, but it had me up till 5 o'clock in the morning, literally falling asleep at the keyboard because I just couldn't make it work, and I wasn't very happy with the way it turned out.
Do you write quickly, edit slow?
I hear music in my head, which is, if you listen to me read it, you can hear it. I will be saying it, and I will say beat for Mike, my sound guy, to make sure that there's a space there, because otherwise it's like somebody coming in too quickly. And we're about to launch something new that I'm very excited about. And in the second of the 2 performances, the spaces have been shaved down, and I'm like saying to my manager, "Can't you hear it doesn't work?" And she's like, "I don't think anybody but you is going to notice that, Heather." I hear it as I go, and I edit as I go. So by the time I'm done, it's really done. But that writing part takes 3 to 4 hours, 5 hours, unless it's a really hard one, and that can take. The speech from the Old North Church, you notice things were a little vague there for about a week before I gave that speech. That, I hope, looked like it was very easy. Probably the hardest thing I ever wrote, because it was, making it easy is really, really hard.
Yep. We're starting to get questions come in. If I could direct some to you. What is the role of, an audience member asks, role of Christian nationalism in the rise of Trump and the current administration? We've talked about conservatism. Christian nationalism. Christian
nationalism, that's an incredibly important question. And I am going to be arguing soon that that is an outgrowth of this inclusion of these traditionalist religious figures in the Republican Party beginning in the 1970s and moving forward from that. Because what it has done is, as pennies or dominoes have dropped, what you started with was including them in the coalition in order to get the sorts of regulation cuts and tax cuts that the Reagan Republicans wanted. What that turned into was a focus, first of all, on abortion as a way to get women back into a more traditionalist society. And by the way, that's not me saying that. That is Phyllis Schlafly, the first time she ever talked about abortion in 1972. The backlash against abortion is actually a frontlash. It happens in the election of 19. Those all should have been 1972, because Nixon recognizes that he's very concerned about winning the election of 1972, shockingly, because he has lost so much of his base. I mean, won it by a landslide. He's lost his base after Kent State. And so Pat Buchanan, who was a Goldwater speechwriter, by the way, urges him to go after the Democratic Catholics over the issue of abortion. And that begins in 72. We don't get Roe until 73, but that really focuses down the rest of the years from that, trying to get those religious traditionalists to remain within the Republican Party. And that, of course, snowballed into the idea of homeschooling, the idea of these mega churches that you get by the late 1970s into the 1980s, the increasing identification of the American nation with Christianity, with evangelical Christianity, yet not with a particular denomination, which will be a huge problem if they actually manage to put it in place, because they're going to be fighting at each other's necks within months. We know this not because of America, but because of every other country that's tried that. So you get this idea of this Christian base, and then you get the extraordinary popularity of the many books by people like Francis Schaeffer and the Left Behind series and so on in the 70s and the 80s, and that whole Christian nationalist base that Trump really turned out, and so did Michael Flynn. I don't know if you were watching that, but I was very concerned about Michael Flynn's tour that he did beginning, I think it was on January 7th, 2021, that turned out this huge base to try and convince people that America was a Christian nation. It has never been a Christian nation. It has never been a Christian nation. And when in the late 19th century, a group of Christians tried to make it a Christian nation by amending the preamble to the Constitution, Congress critters in the late 19th century just stood up and said, no. I have Muslims in my district. We are not making this a Christian nation. So we have been here before. That whole David Barton stuff is bullshit, actually.
We've been talking a lot about voters and movements and the various elected branches. A lot of action happening in the Supreme Court, too. We've got a question about that. When you think about the Supreme Court, what kind of influence are they wielding? How much do they matter? And where do you see the sort of the key cleavage in the Supreme Court being?
So a moving target again, and that's something I think is going to be really important to remember in the months to come, is things are changing constantly. So what was true a month ago is no longer true. And think that, again, one of the things that's destabilizing and one of the reasons it's going to be very important to remember things you really believe and care about because things happen so quickly. And that, if you know your William Faulkner, one of my favorite books ever is Absalom, because in that, the present changes the past. And that's where we are now in a ways. The constant changing of what's happening now changes the way we think about how we got here and how we can get out. The Supreme Court is a changing target because if you think about U.S. At the Donald J. Trump versus U.S., which the Supreme Court decided on July 1st, 2024, they said that a president could not be prosecuted for his official acts while in office under the Article 2 powers, and he had presumed immunity for things he did outside of the Article 2 powers. But this is a part everybody forgets. The Supreme Court said, because we've never made this distinction before, it's the courts that get to decide what it's okay for him to do and what's not okay for him to do. And it was really a power grab by the courts as much as it was a power grab by Donald Trump. Well, now they got themselves a problem because Trump is destroying Congress. He is destroying the prerogatives of Congress. And people have asked me what is the most surprising thing to me about this moment. It's that Republican senators have not stood up to defend the rights of the Senate. And pressure them. If you're into this stuff, pressure them because there's clearly a pressure campaign on them, and there should be. Not to vote for Democrats or anything, but just to protect the Senate. But so the presidency is trying to destroy Congress. But you know what? If it can destroy Congress, it can also ignore the courts. And the Trump administration's deliberate thumbing its nose, basically, at the Supreme Court's 9-0 upholding of the lower court order that they do everything, that they facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, which the administration itself knew was a mistake and was going to try and get him back, and then they decided they could make political hay out of it. They're thumbing their nose at the president over that, and at the Supreme Court over that, and at the attacks on the judges like this one here in Wisconsin and another one in the Southwest at about the same time. That says to the Supreme Court, yeah, might like everything that the Republicans are doing, but pretty soon no one's going to care about you. And you can see this, I think, with John Roberts, who would like not to destroy the Supreme Court on his watch. He's perfectly happy to destroy the modern American state, but he kind of likes the Supreme Court. So we don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do. The Roberts Court has tended to hollow things out and leave the shall in the past, but now they can't really do that. So what is the Supreme Court going to do? One, I don't know, but two, it is interesting that everybody sided against Alito, Justice Samuel Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas the other day, and they, of course, have serious corruption issues. Which in any other era would have led to them to resign or to be impeached. And it is not impossible to think that they will be increasingly sidelined and perhaps encouraged to go sit on a beach or take an RV and drink Mai Tais.
I'm going to read this quote, if I might. I'm a woman in my mid-50s. I've been organizing my community locally for years, almost exclusively by other women. Where are the men? And how do we get them involved?
Well, I can't speak for the men. I would suggest that one of the ways to get them involved is to invite them. Where are the men? I think there is an awful lot going on in America right now, and that, as you know, I see as a product of the what I have called cowboy individualism that the Reagan administration, but starting before that, even with Goldwater, and perhaps even before that, because they were drawing from the traditions of the 1870s and 1880s, managed to cement into American society the idea that to be a true American, you had to stand up, do everything yourself, protect your women folk who would be traditional, stay at home, and your children. You didn't want or need anything from the government, and you didn't need anything from a community. And that, I think, has poisoned the way we talk about gender relations in this country. I think it has certainly poisoned younger men who have no idea how to be a man who can integrate emotionally and socially into a larger community. And you have seen this through things like Gamergate in 2014 and 2015. You see it to some degree, I think, with the people who are active in the Department of Government Efficiency, whose attacks on men and women who have just jobs that they do really well and are integrated into a larger system, they're seemingly cutting those jobs with some glee, as if that is somehow a reflection on getting rid of that whole idea of a functional society because they can't be part of it. So I think we are grappling with that without the recognition that that was never real. That was always a myth. It was always a political myth from the 1870s onward. What has always been real in the United States is communities in which men cooperated with the larger community to create a better world for everybody. And if you don't want to reach all the way back to the American West, although I'm hoping to be writing more about this soon, this was absolutely the case in the American West. Cowboys were not lone foot soldiers by any stretch of the imagination. And they sold their cattle to the American government. They were very much part of a larger community. If you actually wanted to rise in the American West, which cowboys did not, they were essentially wage workers who were analogous to the wage workers in a steel mill in the East, for example. If you wanted to rise, you needed a kinship network. Literally, you needed a kinship network. Kit Carson, for example, had 2 wives, one of whom was indigenous. 3 wives, 2 of whom were indigenous, and 1 of whom was Mexican. You needed those kinship networks. You needed those communities. But if you don't want to reach all that way back, if you think about the way Americans talked about masculinity and being men in World War II, was through friendships, through buddy movies, through the idea of people doing stuff together. There were no American Westerns made out of Hollywood in the World War II years. All the movies you had were World War II buddy movies. This is where we get the GI, General Infantry. This is where we get the idea of people working as a team. And the degree to which we can highlight that is a masculine value as well as a feminine value in the United States, the easier I think it will be for men to step into that role in the modern world.
One last question, back to you. At a time of upheaval and anxiety and deep concern, where do you find nourishment and strength?
From where I always find it, the American people. I wrote A Democracy Awakening thinking that people would have figured out by 2024 that this was the moment, and I anticipated it. I was not prepared for how that election would go. I think there's a lot of reasons that we now understand why it went the way it did, but Americans had not fully wakened up at that time to how fragile our democracy is and how much we truly do love it. And when I look out there today and I see already at least 5 million people in the streets, already, we're not even at 100 days, when I see the fact that AP Nork, which is like the gold standard of popular polling, yesterday came out with a poll that has Trump at a national popularity rating of 39%. When I look at the organizing that is taking place on social media, when I look at the states and people running for office, when I look at the places that people are taking over school boards and are working at local levels, when I look at the AGs around the country standing up for the rule of law, when I look at people who had great jobs with law firms saying we're not going to go to a law firm that stands with Donald Trump, when I look at Harvard standing up, and I look at all of those things, and when I look at the fact that there's a big problem right now in publishing, which you probably haven't looked at because you probably don't read a lot about publishing. You know what they can't publish fast enough right now? Pocket constitutions. And when I look at that, and I look at the times that the United States has lived through extraordinary trauma of people who were in fact trying to destroy our democracy at the time and thought they had a lock on it, and saw the American people then standing up and saying, you know, I might not agree with you about immigration or finance or infrastructure, but by God, I know I care about our democracy. That is what I am seeing in this moment. And I feel like I'm doing my part to try and grow that, make it stronger and bigger. But I also know that we are 1,000% in this together, and that I couldn't do what I do without you doing what you are doing. And I think we are beyond, let's talk about it, and into a movement. And it is an extraordinarily exciting thing to be part of. So that's what gives me hope.
Ladies and gentlemen, Heather Cox Richardson.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here.